Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about Michigan's charter school story. It's a story that's not generalizable to other states. State policy rules matter a great deal, and in Michigan's case, they're distinctive and interesting. Michigan's experiment with charters is a cautionary tale. Of course, Education Secretary Betsy DeVos had an outsized influence on those rules. My own personal view is that choice is good, but as I'll explain, it must be weighed against other normative criteria, especially efficiency, equity, accountability, and community. Michigan placed a big bet on charters to improve education outcomes, but after a quarter century, the state's NAEP performance has sunk to the lowest tier of states. Its African American students rank at the very bottom in elementary reading and math. Detroit has the lowest scores on the NAEP of any major U.S. city. Michigan is one of 5 states to actually decline in reading performance on the NAEP since 2003. Detroit is arguably the foremost example nationally of the adverse consequences of a poorly regulated education market. There is a lot of choice in Detroit, but it has not solved the problems of poverty and segregation. It's made them worse. That will be my argument. Detroit is the site of an important court case in U.S. federal court, the Gary B. versus Snyder. It makes sense that Detroit was the place where the plaintiff lawyers picked to file this case. Just one other note, just 10 years ago, Detroit Public Schools was the largest employer in the city. It was an employer that provided stable wages, salaries, and benefits. It was the heart of the Detroit middle class. It is not anymore. Okay? The story I'm going to tell is focused on 3 aspects of state policy and the way that they have interacted in Michigan. First, I'll say a few words about the school choice policies. Secondly, school finance policies. And thirdly, governance policies. Okay, just a few basics on the charter school policies. It was one of the first. It's passed in 1994. We have a high participation rate in Michigan, among the nation's highest. The caps on charters was removed in 2011. We have cyber charters. There are many authorizers in the state. Their activities are not well coordinated. There's limited oversight of the charter authorizers by the state. Basically, the state has delegated the responsibility for oversight to the authorizers. The participation is concentrated in urban areas in the state. This is a slide that shows you right now the high charter locations. Detroit is more than half of the children in Detroit attend charters. There's also high rates of participation in Flint and Grand Rapids and the other Michigan cities. A distinctive feature of the Michigan cases comes from Gary Mirren, is that a unusually high share of the charter schools are managed by for-profit companies. You can see the line in the middle that goes all the way up. About 80% of the charters in Michigan, in contrast to other states, are managed by for-profit companies. Okay. Let me turn quickly to the finance system, because part of the story is how these two systems interact. Michigan has a foundation system established under Proposal A in 1994. All operating revenues move with the children. When they move from school to school, local districts have no discretion to raise operating revenues. There's a high degree of funding equity. 80% of the children receive their foundation grant is within $500 of one another in charters and districts, but the state matches the revenues poorly with the cost of especially needy children. There's no state aid for facilities. They're funded by local property taxes exclusively. It's pre-Serrano world for facilities in Michigan. Actually, the state would like to move out of the provision of facilities entirely and follow a model that's being used by the charters. Charters in Michigan receive the same funding as the districts in which they're located, except at the very top tier of a small set of high-income suburban districts that receive more. So it's an interesting case. I want to turn to the governance policies because Michigan is a place where the emergency management of the state has intervened in a number of districts on financial grounds. I'll get ahead of the story a little bit. Charters have had an impact on district finances. The district finances has established the grounds for state intervention and the suspension of local government's arrangements. Michigan's emergency management law is very strong. The emergency manager has complete control over finances and academics of the district. They are able to, they have control over curriculum, teacher hiring and assignment, PD, opening and closing of schools. They can nullify any contract, including collective bargaining arrangements. They have been appointed in several Michigan cities, all of which are predominantly poor and African American, including Detroit. It applies both for municipalities and school districts. The famous Flint water example was done under an emergency manager. That fine fellow that emergency manager was moved to be the emergency manager after that to Detroit Public Schools. What do the emergency managers do? They have, as I said, a lot of control. They had, in the case of Detroit, they cut staffing by 25% in 3 years, cut salaries by 10%, increased class size above 5 students above the statewide average, and closed over 120 schools. Okay, in 2 of these districts, Highland Park and Muskegon Heights, the emergency managers transferred the control of the district, the management district, over to for-profit management companies entirely. Okay, that's the context. This landscape, a few years ago, caught the attention of the NAACP, the ACLU in Michigan, and they invited me with some colleagues to do some research on which, the questions were, which Michigan districts are getting into financial trouble, why they're getting into trouble, what's the role of the local decision-making as opposed to state policy, and was there any racial bias in the deficit districts that the state elected to intervene in? This paper is published in the Journal of Education Finance. I'm just going to glide over quickly about 10 slides here just to get a flavor of this and then come back to what I think are some salient points. Okay. So overall, the funding in Michigan has been on a downward trajectory. What you're looking at here is the trend in real per pupil revenue over the entire Proposal A period. You can see that there's been about a 25% decline in real revenue since 2002. 60% of that decline is due to a reduction in tax effort. The state's per pupil foundation grant was nearly $500 lower in nominal terms in 2013 than in 2009. So this is a context of really tight money from the state for all Michigan public schools. Okay, if this is a figure that's I just want you to look at the top. It's showing the foundation revenue only. It's the change in enrollment, the first column. The second column, the change in per pupil foundation grant, which is increasing over this span of, we're looking at a little over a decade, and the change in overall revenue. The point here is that even though the per pupil foundation rate is increasing a little bit, the revenue in Michigan cities declined over this in nominal terms by about 21%. If you adjust that to real terms, it's about 44% decline in real revenue over the span of a decade. It's all because of loss of enrollment. All the money follows the child. If the children go, the money goes. I'll come back to this in just a moment. This is the figure showing all the fund balances of all the districts in Michigan. Okay? Deficits are the grounds for the state intervention. You can see that the shape of this fund balance for all the districts follows the shape of the overall revenue that the state controls. Okay, if you break it out by district racial composition, there are huge differences here. The bottom line is basically showing you the fund balances for a district where at least 40% of the students are African American. Something is clearly going on in those districts. So here's a little bit of the modeling. We wanted for the ACLU, what's causing this? So we try to conceptually, right? What's causing this deficit? We want on the one hand, we look at the revenues. What are the revenues, the per pupil revenues from both the foundation and categorical revenues? We want to look at enrollment because that's linked to the funding. We want, on the enrollment side, we want to look at changes in enrollment that are both due to natural changes in population and also for school choice. Okay, this is where this comes back to the role of school choice in these enrollment changes. On the expenditure side, we're especially focused on the role of high-cost students. In Michigan, we're especially concerned about special ed kids because the state only covers 28% of those mandated costs. Special ed, every special ed kid is a financial loser, and the bigger the disability, the larger the loss. Okay, and finally, we looked at a whole bunch of things that the districts have control over, the things that they can control in their own resource allocation, their employee salaries, their benefits, the class size, their administrative spending, the extent to which they contract out services. Okay, here's the model, here's some results. Okay, what I want to point to you is just sort of quickly as I glide down here, that most of this story is what you'd expect. You get more revenue from the state, the fund balance goes up. It's better to get $1 of foundation funding than categorical funding. Increasing enrollment, I should have explained this. The issue with enrollment changes when a child leaves a district. All the revenue declines, but all the costs don't. Right? So it's that marginal difference between, so getting additional student is beneficial. It's for the, and what I also want to look at is we got both interdistrict choice and charter school choice have a big impact on the enrollment changes. Right? So enrollment makes a big difference. In declining enrollment, you're going to have financial troubles. Right? But a lot of that impacts for the whole state is due to charters. About 45% of that enrollment change problem is just for charters. Though I highlighted here the fact that the charters are not very significant for the whole state. Incidentally, this is over, these results are over 17 years for all districts in Michigan with at least 100 students. Okay, the bottom set of things are the resource allocation decisions that districts have control over. They're basically results that you'd expect. You increase salaries, fund balance goes down. Increase class size, fund balance goes up. Interestingly, contracting out doesn't really help. Privatizing support services doesn't really seem to have, is not a significant effect. But let me turn back to this highlighted one and say, we're kind of surprised. Well, there's not a story here. The story here is that the charters don't really seem to make much difference until we looked at those places that had high concentration and sustained high concentration charters, and bingo. Now we see really powerful effects of districts. What we're looking at here is districts where at least 5%, PSAs are charters, so we're looking at the effect in districts that have at least 5%, 10%, 15%, 20%, 25%, and the number of years that have that sustained. All right, and here we see very large effects of charters on district finances. Okay, one other thing here is that we were looking at, there's an indirect effect of charters also. Special ed is a financial loser. We can see that for the state as a whole. But we also see here that, and these are that when the share of students that go to charters increases, the percentage of the students that remain behind in the school districts who are special ed kids increases. Okay? For Michigan as a whole, districts are spending $500 per pupil out of their general fund to pay for special education costs. In Detroit and other cities with high concentration of charters, they're spending over $1,000 a year out of their general fund revenues for special education costs. Okay, so this is an indirect effect of charters through special ed on district finances. Conclusion: the number of Michigan districts in deficit has increased since 2005. Most of the variation, here's the point, most of the variation, those fund balances, things that the state is so concerned about, are due to things that districts can't control. They're due to the state policies, the resource allocation decision at the local level account for about 20% of the variation, explained variation, and that in areas of sustained high concentration of charter schools, we observed serious problems in finances. Okay, let me go to some broader considerations here. The challenge in these settings, in Detroit and other places, I've described them as one way of posing it, is balancing the goal of increased choice against efficiency and other values. Okay. The relevant question to me isn't whether charter schools are good or bad, but how we can design policies that reap the potential benefits of choice while minimizing the harms. Detroit and other Michigan cities are highly turbulent educational settings. They're extraordinarily inefficient in human and fiscal capital resource use. Detroit is a prime example. Schools open and close without neighborhood input or coordination among the authorizers of the district. A city with hundreds of vacant buildings, and there's no process for ensuring that low performers exit. Kids are moving from school to school willy-nilly. The city has closed over 120 schools, yet there's crowding, too many schools in neighborhoods that are gentrifying. In other neighborhoods, there are no schools at all. Nobody wants, no district schools and no charters. The taxpayers in Detroit are on the hook for $450 million to pay for facilities that have already been closed or demolished. They'll be paying for the next quarter century. This is terrifically inefficient. Families lack information on schools and enrollment procedures necessary for fair access. Schools engage in cutthroat competition, offering kids iPads and sneakers to enroll. Nobody wants special ed kids. They're slipping through the cracks. Transportation is not offered. Okay? There's no central coordination. We have two parallel systems in this city, and both of them are failing. And the lack of coordination between them is harming all the kids. Without centralized student information, kids are moving from school to school without their records following them. This is terrifically, astonishingly wasteful. Detroit kids need early childhood education. This is the poorest city in the country, and there's no way that it's being coordinated now. That's the reality on the ground in Detroit. Policies, I'll just say the second point here is that establishing coherent policies in Lansing, where it has to come from, has been compromised by conflicting visions about the path forward between those who want to strengthen and improve the provision of services within the traditional system as compared to those, including Secretary DeVos, who has worked relentlessly to move the provision of education services outside that traditional system. And it's led to tension and conflict on any number of issues, from assessment, curriculum, student services, right down the line. Finally, I make this point, the civic elite of Detroit could see, the civic elite of Detroit, with the Skillman Foundation taking the lead, could see that this was not working. The civic elite of Detroit had doubts about Detroit public schools. They were in favor of charter schools. They wanted to create a New Orleans-style portfolio district in Detroit. They had the Republican governor on their side. He brought Eli Broad into Detroit, his hometown, said, let's establish a New Orleans-style portfolio. The governor said, we need a united voice from Detroit. You know, you've been fighting with the unions, the community groups, the pastors. Form a coalition. Betsy DeVos did one very positive thing in Detroit. She brought together people who weren't talking to each other before, who were pecking at each other before, and they formed this coalition. I was on it. They did good work. And they were hoping, and I'm going to say, I'm not a big fan of the New Orleans-style portfolio, but compared to what Detroit has now, it's clearly a step forward. There was only a discussion about this in the state legislature because the city had $600 million in debt that was created entirely under the management of emergency managers. The state was on the hook for $2 billion. They had to do something. This is 2 years ago. Betsy DeVos wanted the district to just go away, to dissolve the district and turn the whole thing into charters. The coalition was arguing for one, the state pays the debt, they created it, they pay the debt, return to local control, and the establishment of a Detroit Education Commission, which would have some very, very limited authority over the opening and closing of charters and districts. Down the line, they might have a single enrollment process. They might try to coordinate transportation. They might try to coordinate special education. It had support from bipartisan, and in the end, it went down. My time is up. My time is up. I only had one more slide on suggested policies, and I will not talk about them now.
Thank you, David. Randall?
I yield these good points to Professor Baker.
We'll bring those right back up there. Those look like good points.